Okay. So today, you guys have all got the agenda. It's over there. But first we have to approve the last minutes. Is that correct? Okay. Before we start today, did you guys have a chance to read it, and does it look correct? There's a typo in my name, but I'm okay because it was correct at the top.
Okay, I'm
It
sorry.
was incorrect in the sentence, but it's fine. If it's correct at the top,
Yeah, but it should be correct everywhere.
you think so? I think so.
I'll
All right.
fix that.
Let's fix that. In the sentence, it's under, you know what I mean?
Okay.
Thanks. Did anybody have any changes to the minutes from last meeting?
And,
You got it?
Yep.
Okay. Great. Then we're ready to move into the project status update, right? Well, those minutes are approved. Sorry.
for that.
Oh.
They're just taking care of business.
Right.
Well,
Hey, for the people online, can you see it, the presentation? Okay,
excellent.
good. We'll put you guys,
May need to see that
Right.
answer, right? Yeah.
okay.
I think we kind of,
It's got you up here. Your arrow keys are highlighting them. There you go.
so just kind of reiteration of the agenda. I will give a project status update and I'll give a quick update of the mixed use zone summary. If Brandon gets here before we're ready to start the policy options and discussion, he's going to present most of that information and what we're going to talk to you about each of those slides. And then just give you a quick update on the status of the corridor plan. And I think we sent you a preview of what that looks like. Go to one on the slides and then just next. Okay, but the bulk of the meeting is going to be the policy options discussion.
There's a lot in there, so.
Yeah.
We're not going to kind of highlight things in particular to talk about, but then if you have other comments, that's
Great, thank you.
all right. So just in terms of where we are, what we've been doing, drafted what you got, this preliminary mixed use zone corridor chapter and summary memo. Chris and mostly Chris, you've been going to the planning commission and you've been there. Chris and Lynn have been briefing the council and planning commission and talking to them about various policy issues, some of the same things we all have been talking about, and we'll talk about today, to sort of take things to them in more, I'll say, bite-sized chunks and get some direction. So it's not, here's a whole bunch of stuff at adoption time, let's talk about it all now.
Yeah.
So some of the things that they've been talking about have been sort of the pros and cons of requiring housing, specifically within these mixed use areas, requiring that a certain amount of development that occur there within the area or within a given development is proposed to be housing or residential use.
Like they want us to require, they want the code to require that.
We've
Is that what you're
been
saying?
asking, is that a good idea?
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll talk about
You
it.
don't have an answer. Okay, got it.
Okay, and I think, I can't remember what the answer has been.
Council has requested from some further information from us. Things like who else does this? What might some unintended consequences be? What would it do to housing if we do certain things? They just asked for some more info.
And I had a couple of things that came to my mind. And one is we had seen that development in Lake Oswego on Boone's Ferry that had housing in the back and then parking in the front on Boone's Ferry were like office buildings.
Medical offices.
Medical offices. And so does that count? Does that qualify as housing if it's, in a different building? And then the second thing that came to my mind was what if somebody proposed a hotel? But that's technically not housing.
Yeah.
But if housing was required, how? So those were a couple of things that just came to my mind
Okay, cool.
when we were having that
Right.
discussion, because initially I was thinking, yeah, you know, if you require housing, you'll get housing. But on the other hand,
There might be
is that really going
exceptions.
to give us exactly what we want?
I see. Thanks.
So more questions back to us. Questions. So some of the other things we all been talking about, whether or not to apply, and we've already talked about doing this in this group, but whether or not to apply certain standards a little differently in different parts of those mixed use zones. So some standards would apply differentially, for instance, along or to development that's directly fronting the highway versus development or areas that are off the highway, either fronting perpendicular streets or on the street behind or whatever. And I think generally support for that. How to deal with ground floor commercial requirements. Again, how much, what percentage to require, if we're requiring a certain amount be ground floor commercial. And it could also be ground floor commercial, could be some active uses within residential buildings, community space. So I think that's the other thing to think about there. But again, whether to do it, how much, and how to, and whether to do that just along 43 or 43 as well. We talked about that last time. So we already kind of talked through that issue a little bit. And then whether or not to, and we'll talk about all of this a little more when we get into this. So this is just me telling you.
Yeah, what's coming up.
Yeah, and what the council and planning commission has been talking about. And then whether or not to have a minimum of 2 stories for any development that occurs within these zones. We talked, and I'll talk about this later too, but we also talked to our technical advisory group about this. So these other questions, I'll kind of give you a heads up on what they had to say about that a little later. So in those briefings and talking through those issues with council and planning commission. And then we also have started to draft that full corridor master plan, because a lot of the content from that plan was created during the earlier part of this process. So we put together kind of a format and a table of contents that outlined, and it started to populate the portions of that document that we've already completed the work. So like the vision statement, the goals, the kind of description of conditions, etc.
So this is what the master plan is, what the city adopts along with this zoning.
Along with this.
Okay.
Yep. So that's just kind of what we've been doing since we last met. And then I'll cover this, and then the next thing. Well, this is actually kind of the next thing on the agenda, but the mixed use corridor zone summary. So just to reiterate sort of what we've identified so far, or some of what we've identified so far. What types of uses would be permitted in these mixed use zones? And again, got this with all of you before, but commercial and retail uses, mixed use, so a mix of developments that have a mix of those uses and housing, multifamily housing, and space and recreation, and really almost anything that's currently, most things that are currently permitted in the commercial zone would be permitted here with some exceptions. And then some of the development standards that we've embedded in there already, and a couple of these we'll talk about, some of these we'll talk about today. So maximum setbacks, so having building setback a certain distance from the road, and with that potentially, differing for buildings along Highway 43 versus off of Highway 43. We talked about that last time. We had determined that we did not think it was necessary to have a maximum lot coverage standard, that there are other standards that will control for that. And basically, a maximum lot coverage standard is or unnecessary in light of those other standards. We've talked about a maximum building height of between 45 and 55 feet, 45 feet where we're closer to adjoining existing residential areas, 55 feet where we're closer to the highway, right next to a residential area. We've talked about not allowing off-street parking between the street and buildings that are adjacent to it. We'll talk a little bit more about parking today. And then we've talked about and started to draft these design standards for the ground floor commercial uses and also, stories above that. So we presented some of that to you last time. Continue to kind of work on that aspect of things. And I think we have some more questions around that to talk to you about today. So that's just, again, summary of what we've done so far, what's embedded in the draft mixed use border does.
Ask you a question as a reminder. Are maximum setbacks, are they the same for the whole place, or are they also different in subzones?
They're different. They're in what we've talked about so far is to make them different. So,
Okay, thanks.
yeah. Brandon, Chris, anything to add when I just quickly went over?
No, so not right now.
All right, cool. And we will again kind of get into it.
Well, other than council did sort of give a general thumbs up acceptance of the focus area boundaries that have gone through the whole gamut of working group.
Oh, the dotted lines that we added.
Yeah, so those are sort of what we're calling our final focus area boundaries and working with them forward.
Okay.
So, yeah,
Cool, that's great.
you would agree with that, right? Okay.
And just kind of a clarification for me, when the public is talking about this, and somebody says, well, but I'm right here, right next to it, can I be part of it? Where do we get to the point that we can't adjust this any longer?
Probably, about the public hearing and city council at the very end, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's flexibility. Obviously, we'd like to keep it as locked in as possible, but I think the reason we're not asking for some sort of resolution to lock them in now is that we do want the community to see them and want to be able to make adjustments on their feedback, so.
And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I kind of anticipate that it would be more people saying, hey, I want to be part of this versus people saying, I'm right here and you should take me out.
No, I think you're right. I think if people.
I don't know, I think you get 50-50.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, some may not if you're close, some might want to be,
Yeah.
it certainly may give you an increased value, if there's more opportunities on the.
But again, it also says, just because you're in there doesn't mean you have to do anything.
Correct.
Right, it just means that the places
Options.
surrounding you may change.
No big deal.
Right, no big deal.
Right, no big deal.
Your neighbors might be 5-story buildings, but don't worry about it.
Right. We'll step it back 10 feet.
You've seen tiny houses near PSU that are just
Yeah.
surrounded by giant buildings.
With the old historic houses.
Yeah.
It's like when I saw in San Francisco, and I said, well, in San Francisco, it's like all like the row houses.
Mhm.
And he took a picture from my house from his apartment where he lives now, and there's like these big 3-story buildings, and then there's this little tiny house
Yep.
with 3-story buildings. And that's old. That's been like that for a long, long time.
We might need to use that, so.
Right. If that makes sense.
See, they do it in San Francisco.
Yeah, right.
I'll use.
Oh, okay. Sometime, that little, so amazing, that little bit out there.
Yes.
It was quite a deal.
Yes, I know we got it.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah, so Brandon's gonna continue from here. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sorry for being a little late, by the way. Started leaving the place, and realized I left my laptop. Yeah,
Brandon.
I left my phone at home, but.
One of those days.
Days.
Detroit.
Well, this meeting just went on. Here we go.
He's on grid right now.
Yeah, it's gonna be rough. Here we go.
But trying to bring it back on the rails. So one of the things we've been kind of wrestling with, and I think we've discussed a little bit with council and planning commission, is whether certain uses should be explicitly prohibited from this zone, especially particularly uses that are more auto-oriented, such as drive-throughs, car washes, self-storage, just things that don't really fit the overall kind of vision for the zone, being more walkable and mixed use. So our initial recommendation, which you probably saw in the draft code chapter, is to prohibit those uses listed here on the slide. But a few things to consider. So as I mentioned, generally these uses, since they are really oriented to accommodating auto-oriented uses, they aren't really compatible with walkable mixed-use areas. And overall, these types of uses will just kind of attract more car drivers and car dependency in the area, just kind of counter to the overall vision of what we're aiming to do for these zones. However, with all that said, West Lynn is still going to continue to be largely car dependent community, and the city does have fairly limited areas to site these kinds of uses. So it's kind of a question of how do we balance that? The corridors has most of the available commercial lands to accommodate these types of uses. They should be allowed somewhere in the city. So those are kind of the questions that we're wrestling with. So I guess we'll just open that up for discussion to get everybody's thoughts on whether the city should explicitly prohibit these uses in these zones, or if they should be allowed in certain instances or certain subzones of the mixed use zone. So any thoughts there?
Yeah. I live in Robinwood, and as we all know, in the pipeline is a car wash. And so I'm a little confused as to why the owner is not being discouraged in light of what looks like a potential prohibition of car washes and other car-related businesses.
So Mary, how land use works in Oregon is the time that you apply for the project that you're going to, that you want, the code at that moment applies to that application, no matter what we're going to do a week later, a month later, or a year later. So right now, a car wash on Highway 43 in that zone, in the commercial zone, is a conditional use permit. So they'll have to go get permission, and it will end up going to our planning commission if they do apply, which they have yet to apply. Just came in to discuss it. It has not been applied for. I've spoken to 50 of your neighbors about that. And when everyone wonders why everything's late right now that I'm doing, it's because of that.
45 people were at the
Yeah.
Neighborhood Association meeting last month. And I wasn't at the meeting because I was at a conference in Denver, but what I understand.
I was
they were at
there,
the Meeting.
and I can let you know it was 100% opposition and spoke directly to the owner, saying, we don't want it.
So we do want to make sure that this meeting isn't.
Right. Yeah, so, so it comes,
Talk about.
yeah, so it comes down to what's allowed today. I apply for something,
Sure.
is the code. So they can take it and say, well, right now, this is a conditional use permit, and that's what they're applying. It would be applying if they apply.
What I wanted to say was that what I heard reported out from the meeting was that many of the people were talking about that use doesn't fit in with Vision 43, which
Right.
is good that people are aware.
Pay
of
attention, yes, thank you.
what
All
we're
those
talking
meetings
about
and stuff.
Vision 43. So
So Russell Williams wants to talk, but one of the things I do want to say is, so putting aside a car wash, because that's not what we're going to discuss, but car uses, like for instance, every single one of you own a car, and every single one of you need it, I assume, are driving cars that need their oil change. So should an oil change place be allowed on Highway 43? Or if not, then where,
then where do you get your oil change?
yeah, would be oil change, or do you need tire changes, or, not giant automotives, but, small shops where you just go in and, get your stuff done.
Right.
So that's the question, that's more what the question is about.
Okay.
Isn't,
I mean, we did identify.
Specific.
Yeah.
So I can understand the question better. Does this mean, oh, wait, I'm sorry, someone online had it.
yeah.
I think Russell put his hand down.
I'm sorry, Russell. Oh,
I saw a note that said,
okay. Well, then.
I put it back up.
oh, you put it back up. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I just had a thought. The thought that I had on, like, I understand the vision and not wanting car repairs or storages and that kind of thing. It's just, I thought it was maybe short-sighted to limit drive-throughs. Because if the vision is to have, like, let's just say you have a bakery with a drive-through on the side, but now it's not allowed. Like little things that I think we're trying to attract, but it might be limiting unintended consequence.
Yeah, or like a coffee shop or a coffee cart or something like that, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good comment. Thank you, Russell.
Can I just, sorry, I'm trying to get clarity on, if we have the current situation, and are we saying future situation is no more, meaning, say, Enterprise Oil shuts down, well, now no one else can open again? Or could someone open another oil shop within that, or another car wash with the other car wash was? I'm just wondering if it sort of over time deteriorates those services because you have not allowed anymore.
Does. So it would be, it would be usually when there's a change of the business, unless it's sold to be as is, then the current day's code would apply. So, yeah, if Enterprise closed, then the next thing to open there would, in this case, if we were to eliminate those, would not be.
Yeah, that's kind of a downside, I would say, right? Because then you end up with this empty place probably.
And if I have to, we would have to, and the cost would be to clean up
Yeah.
and have to scrape it to turn it into something else.
Yeah.
It wouldn't, theoretically, it wouldn't be just a vacant auto-oriented use in perpetuity. It would redevelop into something more mixed use, walkable. This is kind of like the long-term vision. We recognize there'd still be auto-oriented uses in the foreseeable future that can continue to operate. Just once it came time to change hands and redevelop, there'd be that.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the goal with a lot of this, is to see some degree of change and redevelopment and additional more intensive development in all of these areas, and some transition certain uses to others at the point where that property is ready to do that. Yeah. So, but yeah, the things that are not allowed, they get to stay there. It's not uses, they go away. They're not allowed.
And there's no way to like if it was like, we should make sure that we can allow the same use, but no additional ones, like grandfathering type of situation, or is that not recommended because of?
It would generally not be recommended, because the point is to let those uses stay, but not continue. I mean, that's generally the point of not allowing those. I think it's trying to kind of see them change over time. And so, sometimes, but there can be, I mean, you can have exceptions to that. But if you're asking, who would recommend that? Not really. But some of the exceptions that are pretty typical are if something's destroyed, by fire or whatever, that it can be rebuilt and it can continue to be the same thing. Rebuilt, reestablished is the same.
Or someone just sells the business to somebody else.
Yeah, or somebody just sells the business. It's not a change in its use, it's just a change in it.
But it couldn't expand or anything like
Typically, you wouldn't let it expand. Again, you can have some exceptions to that. You can allow, so these things are called non-conforming uses. That's the zoning planning terminology, because they don't conform, they're not consistent with what your code now says. They were allowed at some point in the past, but now they don't conform, they're not consistent. So some codes, I just had a discussion about this in the river on Monday night. They're updating their code generally, and the question there, one of the questions was, right now, they don't allow any expansion of a non-conforming use at all. So but some codes allow okay, you can expand it by 10% or something, or maybe you can, in one of the, not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but one of the comments from the planning director is well, what if you've got a barber shop in a residential zone and they want to add an ADA accessible 100 square foot ADA accessible bathroom? Can they do that? Well, right now, their code says they can't. So that, situations like that, providing a certain amount of flexibility is why some cities' codes say you can expand this thing that's not allowed, but only up to a certain point, and maybe only for certain reasons. So that's a long answer to your question.
So some thoughts, and these are not directed towards anything, but they fall under two umbrellas. One, that the articles, which I'm sure you'll read, shortfall every the next 5 years. Two, That 43 is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is projected to become a greater and more heavily used arterial form of transportation for Greater City of Portland, to Canby, Oregon City. It's a throughway for many communities, not just Westland. So under those two lines of thought.
And can you tell me what you're, like, what articles you're referring to?
Oh, the Westland tidings came out.
Newspaper.
Yes.
And it said that.
Yeah. So under those, and also, but also realizing we're only talking about isolated zones. When we're first talking about drive-throughs, that is, unfortunately, the way that the large people consume large amount of food. Fortunately, Portland and Oregon has the lowest per capita fast food ratio in the entire United States, which is something that a lot of Oregonians are very proud of. We successfully driven out all but Burgerville on 43 at this point. But if there's an In-N-Out, I'll fight you. But we won't, and that's not ever in the theory. But that might be something that, and raising funds, and if people are driving there, that gives reasons for people to stop. And that's kind of one of the goals, is to give people reasons to stop. And that's encouraging commerce, et cetera. And that doesn't mean national chains, et cetera. Second one, car and drive-throughs can also be coffee shops, et cetera. Second, car washes. The current car wash that we have only on 43, there's very limited car wash options on 43, and part of car maintenance as well as automotive repair. There used to be two most commonly, when you speak to residents, or at least from the experiences that I've heard again and again, when you're asking automotive repair, the two most frequently used businesses are a business that used to be in Westland and on 43 and is now relocated to Oregon City, and one just outside Westland off 43 in Lake Oswego. And so the two most recommended places that when you talk to other people, where do you go, where should you go, are literally just outside of Westland. So Westlanders are having to go put their money in other cities just for our own auto repair. So just like I said, under these umbrellas, these are just thoughts and considerations, not driving forwards. So maybe allowing a small percentage of a good quality auto. Self-storage, I think absolutely that is contrary to everything we've discussed. Walkability, it probably isn't going to add to any of the goals or any of the things we've described. And in general, the thought behind prohibiting drive-throughs, car washes, and automotives is absolutely applicable. But under the idea of this is about to become an increasingly material form of transport, and Weston could probably use some extra bucks laying around in the coffers, if you will, then maybe it's something big.
Does
So
ODOT
just
have, excuse me, does ODOT have projections as to the increase in traffic over the next 10 years?
So if you look at the
Where are we
development,
getting that
if you
back?
ever look at Oregon City's development, also if 205 is going to eventually, toll road, 205 is still going to eventually become a toll road, that's going to increase a large percentage of traffic. People are going to move away the hub.
And I haven't seen those, either articles or the projections you're talking about. So
Okay.
I would-
So like I said, I'm not trying to drive towards a point.
So the one thing is, you're not gonna get someone from, commuting from wherever to drive through and get their oil changed on the way to work, But, what we're really talking about are services for people who live in Westland. And one of the things you can do is actually carve out, like maybe just have a part of Highway 43 that it continues to just be general commercial. I mean, you don't have to shove everything into the mixed use.
Don't have to, but.
Well,
Here's a map. It's the
It's
decision.
kind of looking that way because right now, I think all of the areas that are currently zoned commercial on Highway 43, we have identified as potential mixed use
In the
zones.
focus areas, yeah.
In the focus area. I mean, that's where they are. So, I mean, that would be a departure from what we've been talking about. We would have to then sort of revise the mixed use boundary zones
Yeah.
to retain some pure commercial zoning and so yes, it's a possibility, but it's not something we talked about. It's not the direction.
Right.
I think you're weighing like, well, what's gonna make Westland a great place to live in 20 years? Is it automotive shops
I
or
mean,
like mixed use commercial space?
It really is kind of a policy choice. I mean, there are reasons for that Brandon described for not allowing these uses, and they mostly have to do with, frankly, their impact on walkability. If you've got a drive-through, that's more cars that are crossing the area that people need to walk through, walk across, and so it does have an adverse effect on walkability, and it increases the potential for conflicts between people driving and people watching. So it has a safety implication. So, and then on the flip side, as y'all have talked about, those things are going to go somewhere. They're going to be located somewhere. There is within the larger community a potential need for some of those types of businesses. And so if you don't allow them here, where do you allow them? So that's sort of the policy question. And
So
it's trade-off.
in 50 years, we can convert our garages into housing space because cars will just come pick us up and take us where we need to go, and they will be repaired and maintained elsewhere.
Yeah.
But that's a long time in the future.
People, yeah, it's a good point that some drive-through uses will still be in demand and it will still bring in visitors to the area, but then you have to also think the vision is to bring visitors to come and actually stay and visit the area, leave their cars and be able to walk around. I think visiting the area and then just staying in your car and going through a drive-through is kind of contrary to the vision of the project. But again, it's like Matt said, it's a policy choice.
Can I ask you, does drive-through include someone who has a cart? Like a coffee cart? When it says drive-throughs there,
If you are driving out and rolling down your window of your car and ordering a copy from that cart, that would be what call it, shack.
okay,
Yes, yeah, it's really about like
they wouldn't be able to get a business
they're
license.
being served by, they're serving people who are in their car, driving up,
So Dutch
getting their
Brothers.
Dutch brother.
We have drive-through
We already have.
dry cleaners in Robinwood.
Yeah, there's an, yeah. There's not.
I think we have Russell wanting to say something.
Yeah, Russell? Oh, you guys.
I was just
want
gonna, I mean, off the top of my head, just think about Bellagio's in Old Town. Like they technically have a drive-through, and as a business owner, if you wanted an additional source of revenue to keep afloat, like why would we limit things like that? The unintended, like, yeah, maybe I don't want to open a business here because I can get additional revenue sources from the people that are going through by having a side window.
Yeah.
I don't think you're talking about like.
The drive-through thing for me is not like black and white. Because I can see that most of the others are.
There are reasons to allow them and there are reasons to limit them. So you
Yeah.
gotta have to decide which thing is most important and most consistent goals of that planning.
Well, and what did the community say in the surveys, what they
Yeah.
wanted?
Now that
We didn't ask about drive-throughs
specifically
specifically.
about drive-throughs, and it's really the surveys.
There definitely were some comments, the open-ended comments that were clearly opposed to car washes specifically.
This town, anti-car wash.
I was gonna say, we have dirty cars.
Like keeping them.
Oh, yeah, I wanna keep it that way. We don't wanna.
And it's okay if y'all don't, if we don't get through, but,
Okay.
Why don't we do it around the table and
Yeah.
just have someone, make a 10-second, 15-second comment on it.
Like a yes, no on each one. So-
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, this is not a yes, no, but I'm wondering, is the city council, in light of our $9 million deficit, annually. Sort of positively inclined to encourage business regardless of whatever type is, in particular, the car wash is generating $500,000 in tax revenue. Are we talking about the deficit, and is that affecting Vision 43?
I don't think the car wash would generate that much tax revenue because it would just get the property tax that is the 2.12 for the value of the property. So it wouldn't be that much whether it was a car wash or something else, that the amount of money that they generate. Let's see. Because we don't have sales tax or anything like that. And the $9 million deficit is projected at the end, not of this biennium or balanced, it will be at the end of the next biennium. So we go through, let's see, 2026, 27, so 28, 29, by 2029. And hopefully with some of these things, waterfront and Vision 43, if any, even if incremental changes start happening, that could generate more property tax revenue. But yeah, so businesses in and of themselves pay property tax. They have a business license, but
Which is $100.
yeah, and whatever fees they pay to planning to get their, business going and their permit fees to the building department. But they don't, businesses in and of themselves do not generate that much revenue. But if we have more businesses in lieu of some of these residential areas that we've included, then we're shifting a little bit of the property tax burden or the funding burden from residentials to businesses.
Commercial gets more taxes than residential. Is that true?
No, that's the same.
So one thing to think of as we're talking about this, and I'll keep this short, is not all businesses are the same. Right? Some businesses, we'll just pick on McDonald's, drive-through McDonald's. They do about 70% of their business through the drive-through. So you come in, make your purchase and leave, right? There's no additional purchases being made. You have left. You are in your car somewhere, you're gone. And most of that money goes back to Chicago. It does not stay in our local economy. Some very low-level service industry jobs are created, but that's a very limited number of people making that money. Other businesses, I'll use a local success, the Willamette Garage food cart. That is a business where a lot of people go and stay and maybe have a beer and a food. And it's like, yeah, we're going to stick around a while. I'll get another beer. Do you want another something? They add additional purchases because you're out of your car in the environment, hanging out with friends and family. That's what we're trying to get to.
And while you're there, you might want to go to that little shop down there. and
Well,
see if
right,
they
you're
have
also on
some-
Main Street, so there's little shops, or my wife and daughter were at the thing last night, market, Wednesday market. Of course, we have new things at our house after the market. I didn't know we needed that, but here it is. So I think that's kind of where, again, it's not all businesses are the same. I'm not saying we get rid of some and not others, but the goal is to have places for the community to interact and to be. That's in the very, very beginning of this project. It was places for the community to gather and to be, and businesses that are beneficial to our community. So obviously there's some subjectivity in what's beneficial, but just kind of keep that in mind, the difference of a locally owned food car pod and a McDonald's owned by someone in Chicago. So again, I'm not saying either are wrong, but they are different for our community. And last thing I'm going to say is we can't have everything. We're a small town with limited commercial space. We're not going to have a Chevrolet car dealership. Not happening. You got to go all the way over to McLaughlin. It's like 4.5 miles.
You gotta go into a 5 though.
Exhausting. You have to drive your car to go get another car. So I'm just saying, some things we just won't be able to have in a small town like a physically, topographically challenged environment like ours with the river and hills. So just keep that in mind. Like the goal of Vision 43 is for benefit to the community, both gathering and economically. So I will stop for now.
Thanks for reframing or whatever. Reminding us.
Whatever that was.
Reminding us where we are.
These are hard questions. 100%. These are hard questions. No doubt about it. we've spent countless hours having these discussions internally, so.
I think one of our biggest challenges is this is all developed stuff. It's not like we're going,
Correct.
oh, look at this giant big.
Blank canvas.
Yeah.
Let's
It's
build
not
something
Vegas
here.
desert.
Correct.
Let's build something here. Let's put all the automotive uses over on this corner and then we'll do this other lovely. We don't have that option.
Yep,
So that's, I
very
think,
good
one of our
point.
biggest challenges.
Very good point.
So two other thoughts. One, just again, experiences when speaking with multiple people who live in the county, talking about West Lynn, no one has ever stopped in West Lynn. Ever. They just, and when you speak about West Lynn, they have no mental picture. They've never stopped at any business in West Lynn. So if we can get them to stop at anything, that might be a benefit. It might be a deterrent. We don't, whatever. And the second thing is just, I was recalled as I was driving up here, speaking to an attorney. And I said, I've got to get off the phone here in a minute. He said, why? And he said, I was going to this meeting. He said, oh, do me a favor. Just tell them. Put in dispensaries and pot shops for God's sakes and get the money, add an extra tax if you can. I said, it's not going to come up.
Okay, but now it's coming.
You don't have to put them in. You just have to make it legal. Carol knows.
I know. So now,
Yes.
we build a societal.
Yeah.
We do have a few more questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the prohibited uses, like Lynn had a suggestion, just kind of really quickly go through those.
Yeah.
So,
That's, yeah.
I'm done.
good.
Yeah, my thoughts are is that, drive-throughs and stuff like that, if you have them right along Highway 43, you're gonna start messing things up. And, we are including a lot of territory outside of 43 that drive-throughs and oil changes, stuff like that should be able to be included in. And I think that's, everybody thinks it's gonna be right on Highway 43, which is not what we want or need.
Yeah.
So I think you have to have some of it earmarked for allowing drive-throughs and oil changes and stuff like that, because those are, core businesses, what people actually need in West Lynn.
Actually, no, thank you, your response. And it's also, we're projecting of the model of what a drive-through is now versus what maybe a drive-through is in the future. So we're, maybe eventually a drive-through is we're projecting off the business models, what they are today. In 10 years, there may, like food carts didn't exist X years ago. The food cart model just didn't exist. In X number of years, there may be a drive-through model where everyone's like, oh, and we don't know what it is yet. And we've made it unless we can,
So you're saying to leave those open?
Yeah, I think you have to say, okay, let's, we can't sit there and say that you can't have a oil can Henry's there because, it's not allowed. And I think you all of a sudden, you're starting to limit yourself as to who actually wants to come in. I think those are the services that we do need as a community there. I don't think that they're going to be all right along Highway 43. I think that along Highway 43, you sit there and you see more of the 4-story buildings, more like the Weiser block down in LO. And then as you get back off on it, maybe you do have the oil change, maybe you have Starbucks or something. It might even be actually a nicer, quieter Starbucks that you're back off there. So, and I still think I get the walkability part of it. I live down at Cedar Oak Boat Ramp and I walk up to Walmart and pick up my groceries and then I walk down. I'm probably 1.1% of the people who actually do that just to get a walk in. So but the walkability, that topography is not happening. It's people from Hidden Springs are going to drive or walk down to Walmart, try to pick something up and bring it back up the hill. And that's just, so the walkability, and I do appreciate it. I totally do. So you can't necessarily make something that isn't really feasible. And I mean, I go to Great Clips or Sports Clips and then, take off.
Yeah.
I don't go hit Market Choice or,
Right.
But so there's a lot of walkability issues that aren't necessarily, they're just topographical issues, so.
Well, I think that what Chris was talking about original vision, what I see is that
Again,
we're trying to create a place where you might drive to this one place, but you want to be in the full space and you want to, so the walkability sort of
yeah.
comes from you've arrived.
Yeah.
And now it's walkable.
Oh, yeah, no, and I get that, you know, Willamette is very good because it's fairly level, it's not as topographically challenged as Highway 43 is because of the hills and everything else. So, and then I see the main problem, I see the whole thing is again, back to the increased thoroughfare on 43. I think that's gonna be nothing but increasing. And, you know, we can say that the cars aren't gonna be here in 50 years. Okay, what's the alternative? And, you know, I don't see it happening. So, but that's kind of what my thoughts were on, so.
Thanks, those are good thoughts. I don't really have thoughts more of a vote. So I just want to vote, because I want to move on, but I just want to say that like all those prohibited uses, after this discussion, I agree with. Because I think from the surveys that the community wants and what we're supposed to be here is representing that, they don't want to see more of these other things on 43 if it's to be a place that we can interact with and hang out and do all those things that the community said they wanted. And I think that will get people to stop being a place where you want to be. Yeah.
Just a quick refresher. You know, we did this with planning commission. I haven't done it with council yet, but I'm happy to report back that we have mixed feelings about all this as a working group. I don't need everyone to say yes or no. I really can report back. I mean, obviously Councilor Reich is here as well, but and Commissioner Jones for the planning commission. I'm always happy to report back that look, we have mixed feelings, and some are yes, some are no, and I don't need everyone's like, yep, we're okay, we can go do this. So we want your honest opinions because it helps to feed how Commissioner Jones will think about it when they get to a point where they need to recommend, and how Councilor Bright will get to when we go to approval. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Why don't we go to the Westland Chambers, Bo and Russell, real quick votes.
Yep.
Westland Chamber?
Hi,
Maybe-
I'm a firm believer of the drive-through process because it's really hard to get when you're on a highway or even on a main street. It's hard to get people to pull off. But if they will pull off for like a cup of coffee, at least they get to see what other businesses will be there, and that's going to start sticking in their mind. I'm also a firm believer that if you have a successful business, they will invest in your community. And that's in the long run, what you're going to be looking for is that true investment back to the community.
Good points. Thank you.
Bo? Bo, are you there?
I'm here. I'm just listening.
What's your vote?
I'm good with everything that you guys are saying.
Okay.
He's
All
in the
right.
middle like the rest of us.
Russell? Russell, are you there?
Might have stepped away. I think he's at work right now.
Okay.
And he did come.
You already,
Yeah.
okay, all
We have
right,
a couple comments, yeah.
all right,
Thank you for you kind of the next one.
okay.
And if we're gonna do kind of votes on them all, let's
Well, I don't know.
make sure we manage it tonight. But then we can do that and have a discussion, but we may not have time.
Can I real quick say, this might be something that, you know, like I said, if you were starting with a clean slate and you could say, all the automotive stuff is over here, could this be something that we could maybe consider as a sub-zone kind of thing?
Yeah, that was.
Yeah.
So move on to the next one. So we've discussed this one a little bit with ground floor uses. Brought this up a little bit earlier, so I'll just keep this pretty brief, but our current recommendation is to only apply the specific ground floor design and use standards along Highway 43 frontages. And that would include a maximum of only allowing a maximum of 50%
residential on the ground floor, and the rest has to be commercial or some other community use, the other permitted use that we list. And then we also have those specific design standards. So I think it was a minimum height of that first level, weather protection standards, and other design standards, just to help kind of create that kind of Main Street feel, kind of connects the storefronts and businesses with the pedestrian realm. So a couple considerations, kind of like I just mentioned, it helps kind of promote the overall pedestrian friendliness of the environment. And it's just another thing you have to keep in mind is how you're going to balance some of those design requirements with ensuring that they're flexible and achievable for developers, but also still meet what the community wants to see. So kind of a quick and dirty summary there. So any thoughts? Do you have a question on this? Let's just keep it open to.
Is there anything behind that box?
Actually, we did have an extra slide with some examples from other communities and how they do this. So Fairview, for example, they have their storefront district, and we kind of, for our first draft, copied their housing limitation of 50% on the ground floor facing that key frontage area. Vancouver's was a little bit more targeted. They have a 25% maximum, and they apply theirs to multiple different streets, not just their main street. Gresham, similar to Fairview, 50% maximum for housing along key frontage areas. And then Beaverton is a little bit more complex and also more targeted. You can kind of see in that map there where they have different storefront standards on different streets. So yeah, I think now we can filter it out.
Can you define key frontages in the sentence?
The areas that have specific storefront standards. So
Is that just in the facing?
that's how we currently are recommending it. And the question would be, should it only apply to 43 or certain segments of 43, or are there side streets that it should apply to? So yeah.
Yeah, that's because this point we said we'd apply those standards or requirements along 43. And I think we just want to make sure you're still good with that earlier discussion in there.
And if you go to the next slide, it did include a couple examples of what that could look like. So I just mocked up, some side streets that potentially could be other key frontages. I'm not as familiar as you all are, obviously, so this was just kind of conceptual of what it could look like. So yeah, I guess here's the question: is whether the city should require along the entirety of 43 within the mixed use zone, that is, or just certain segments or subzones, or require on every street throughout the mixed use zone, which we would not recommend. So that would be a little.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
You're gonna have a lot of empty spaces.
Yeah.
And so you go like off on this side thing off of 43 just to provide some, like a developer could have like one building and then include the side street a little bit.
Yeah, if you have a corner,
Yeah,
like
like it's more natural feeling kind of.
Yeah, and I highlighted that Hood Street as well, because I know that currently is kind of developed in that way, and I think there is kind of a benefit of having that off the highway where it's a little quieter. So it'd be kind of beneficial to identify those specific.
So if we went with the first bullet point, it just it's required along 43. Developers who might be going around the corner or taking a property that fronts on another street, they could still meet that requirement. It doesn't, it doesn't prohibit them from doing it, it's just not required.
Right.
So I think that allows sufficient flexibility that the developers can figure out what's going to be best, meeting the requirements and then best for their business.
And to be clear, this then is to influence commercial development, like retail space basically.
So wherever you want to kind of.
The reduces residential space.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Just wanted to
So I
say
think
that.
it's just a multifamily house.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think the planning commission made the percentage, simply because if you have a narrow building that's facing 43, their primary concern is only part that face 43. Needed to necessarily be commercial, they probably weren't concerned about seeing back. And so percentages, depending on the layout of the building, so the percentages were an area where it's hesitancy. So, but there was a general consensus of agreement that if it faced 43, it was generally assumed that would be commercial. And if it wrapped around,
Flexible. Yeah. Yeah, and the percentage really refers to the length of the store frontage, the total area. Right. That way you don't
So you
end up
could-
with commercial just behind residential units, which probably would happen.
But you could have a building with half of the frontage on 43 was some kind of commercial, deli, little shops, whatever. But the other half of that building could have
More.
residential that, where people, so it could be residential for all 4 floors and then it'd be commercial and then residential.
You can even do shallower commercial uses, right?
Yeah.
A third of the structure going back,
Yeah.
or, we're leaving that open to flexibility, but we're saying right along the highway, we want to see commercial first floor.
Yeah.
From a certain percentage.
And you're saying that other jurisdictions go up to 50%, and that seems to be something that's buildable, that market is building that.
I hesitate to give you a definitive answer on that, Lynn. I mean, what I will say is that in areas where the jurisdiction has required 100%, that's been full, and they have seen vacancies. And so do I say in today's market, 50% is going to get every one of those full? Not necessarily, but maybe. I think it's a good starting point. And the other thing I would say about these standards is, look, if you don't, these are not meant to never be changed.
Right.
We want to establish something that we think is a good starting point. I think that would be a good starting point. And I think if you have some experience with what developers and also, you're asking development community folks, what do you think is feasible, realistic, reasonable? So we're going to get some comments on that. And then don't wait 20 years to update this stuff. Get 5 years worth of experience, see how it's looking. If you need to tweak some of these numbers, because I think that's why I can't tell you, oh yeah, everywhere 50% is just exactly the right number, and it does vary, by jurisdiction. So, but I think that is sort of a reasonable rule of thumb.
And I think most other jurisdictions are also experimenting with it. Those examples are just to balance what other jurisdictions currently have their standards, but they probably have seen very little of it.
I think you showed an example in a previous meeting where there was like some commercial on 2 sides of the building, and then there was like a little courtyard area at the entrance to a multi-story, and that was all one building.
Yep. One building, same floor. Yeah.
Victoria, do you have a comment?
On this one, not a whole, other than it's hard to change. So if you decide that housing is okay on that first floor, it's difficult later on to change. So I definitely would possibly go a little bit more restricted. But again, your idea is to make this a neighborhood friendly. So of course you're going to want folks, but what's going to attract people off when they're driving off the highway? And I think businesses will attract more folks driving through the highway.
I just thought of something just to make sure I understand. If you had a 4-story building, does this mean that 2 stories would need to be commercial?
No, it means just a ground floor.
Okay. It's only for, oh, that's right. That was, sorry. That word right there. Yeah. Duh. Okay.
You got there.
Thanks.
Hey, teamwork makes the dream work, right?
Sorry.
Here we go.
You can still allow.
Yeah, no, it just,
If somebody wanted to have an office.
no, I just totally forgot that word.
Yeah.
But we talked about Hood Street, that is a good example. The behind and down below Crumble and the orthodontist, and on the backside there on Hood, where across from where the old post office used to be. That's a really good example because those are smaller businesses, but generally they're all full. But they're not on the highway either. They actually do get a lot of community members back there. So I think that's kind of what we're talking about, is they don't have to take up the entire depth of the first floor. They can be smaller salons or pet stores or whatever it happens to be, but it's that commercial activity is going to have a lot more life to it than ground floor residential in this case.
And above the ground floor, you could have a mix of
Sure.
office, residential.
Yeah.
There are some. Don't need a lot of people walking in and out the door.
Right.
That's-
Yeah, this is a hard one. It's going to be hard to get right, but we'll get as
And
close
again, I
as we
think-
can to right. You know?
And like what Brandon said, we're seeing different communities sort of experiment with or try some different percentages. And that's why you saw some different approaches to this.
Like Matt said, the thing that we have seen not work is requiring 100%, because that's when you end up with vacancies. You see that everywhere in Portland.
Yeah, I've seen it, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, 100% commercial.
On the
Yeah,
ground
you see
floor,
right, yeah.
Yeah.
Those back sides are going to be pretty quiet unless you have a street back there,
Right.
to draw people to that back side.
Gotcha.
Or even just 100% of the frontage.
Or
There's
that,
gonna
right.
be segments of it that are probably vacant.
And disturbance don't help.
Okay.
No.
Russell, do you have any comments?
I do not.
Okay,
Thanks.
all right.
All right, moving on.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Slide. So some other design concepts that we're considering. One would be requiring a minimum of two-story development, just to ensure that properties aren't underdeveloped along the corridor. And I believe this is an item that was discussed with the city council. They favored.
They asked for some more information.
Okay.
I felt like wasn't there some trepidation on this one about requiring? There were a couple people who were ready to go. PC kind of felt the same way. They were pretty ready to go on that one. But I think we had a little bit of consternation on this. Just wanting more
Yeah.
information.
Yeah, and we did have some good comments from our technical advisory committee just a couple days ago on this item about being a little cautious towards requiring minimum two-story across the entire mixed-use zone, because there still will be demand for lower intensity residential, like right off of the commercial corridor. So might want to be a little bit more targeted with this one, or explore other tools that kind of help promote more intensity, such as floor area ratio. Right? Is one that came up. So some things to think about with that requirement. We're also talking about pedestrian plaza standards and requirements. Our initial recommendation is we talked about requiring a maximum setback along 43, however, allowing exceptions to that maximum setback for pedestrian plazas or courtyards, things that kind of fit the overall intent of being a walkable community.
Yep.
That includes things like street furnishings and landscaping features. We're considering those sorts of standards. We're also looking into dated block size standards and pedestrian connectivity standards, which I believe the city already has standards for those things. Just be a matter of whether the mixed use zone should deviate from what's already on the books there. Some other concepts are access ways and connectivity. So requiring pedestrian connections between neighboring properties or access ways where there's a street dead end. So example of that would be like a mid-block connection showing the graphic at the upper right. And then lastly here, we would recommend applying new landscaping standards that are a little less restrictive than what the city currently has. So the current standards are requiring a 25% of an entire site's area
to be landscaped for residential and 20% for commercial, which is quite a bit of area for a more mixed use, higher density zone. So we recommend lowering that percentage and also considering other less land intensive landscaping standards, such as like green wool, green roofs, or green walls, or green stormwater infrastructure. So things like that. You can kind of see some examples here in the picture on the bottom right. So now I'll open it back up and see if people have thoughts on any of these.
And just, I'm going to add a couple quick words from the technical advisory group discussion. So Brandon mentioned that they had comments on a number of these things, and he mentioned what they said about the two-story development and the might want to provide a certain amount of flexibility on that, particularly for smaller sites or developments, and think about using that floor area ratio requirement as a substitute for number of stories. The other things they said was they generally supported most of these recommendations. In terms of the requirements for amenities within plazas, they said sort of bigger or deeper the plaza. This was one of the planners from Oregon City said, for those bigger, deeper plazas, they require more amenities. So it doesn't just become this open, empty space. Mm-hmm. So for plazas or courtyards that are less deep, they don't require as much landscaping or seating is fine. But if you're going to have something that's bigger, they require more. And that's
a giant.
Yeah, so they said you want to avoid that, and then they also said they said it's tough, like Brandon was just saying, to hit those percentage standards for landscaping, and they talked about just what we said, kind of allowing for more things to count, and even thinking like some of the stone concrete from water base. That's it.
So that's what they're saying is and with their recommendation, we're dropping from 25 to 20%.
So something closer to 10 or
10, 15.
Yeah, and then allowing silver.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, gotcha.
I think Russell had a comment. Go ahead, Russell.
I was just thinking, from a business perspective, if you restrict things, that's prohibitive to opening, which is opposite of what we're trying to create, right? So if instead of prohibiting or just restricting it to anything 2 stories or more, why not incent 2 stories or more?
Yeah, I think that's, whether it's the reductions of SDCs or whatnot, there are financial mechanisms to create incentives for building. Obviously, those are policy questions that council will have to review. But yeah, it's not unheard of, and that's a good idea. Thanks, Russell.
And I think that was also part of the council discussion was rather than being really restrictive, limiting this is can we encourage people to do what we want?
Yeah.
And then you do run the risk, if it's not a requirement, of them not doing what you
Not
want.
doing it,
But,
that's right.
but if the incentives are designed, then probably will get closer.
That's right.
And again, something that was a couple different commissioners was in these zones having the overreaching comment was having a there, just having little niches and I just have my notes of the ideas and the ones I had brought up a long time ago, art projects, bike repair stations, whatever, those, it's not those, whatever, something that makes people stop, something that engages the community, something that if we're making these walkable community engagements, give them a thing, a workout station, whatever, something that specifically gives them an intent that this is why you should be interacting with this space, as opposed to it's empty, fill it with your imagination.
Right.
Yeah.
I have to just play one.
But making sure
I'm talking about those bubblers.
Splash pad.
Yeah.
Splash pad.
Splash pad.
A puppy splash pad.
Oh, boy. Here we go.
But yeah, if we are thinking about amenities within those areas, make sure there's something people want to use, enjoy it.
Kind of fits under the umbrella of pedestrian amenities and street furnishings, which is something we'd have to flesh out a little bit more.
Yep.
Just what that means. Similar concept.
So I think the 2-story development minimum too, I kind of wonder if you could leave that in place with incentives for more than that. so that you at least are still saying, look, we need to make this a more dense community.
Yeah.
But if you go 3, you get this, you go 4, you get this, you go 5, you get that.
Yeah, like a tiered incentive program, yeah.
Sort of a tiered incentive thing with a minimum too.
Yeah.
Because it does kind of say, to have that, it says, here's our vision for also other commercial developers that might go, well, that's great. I'm glad that they have a 2-story because I want to build like a 4 and wouldn't want someone to put a 1-story in.
Yeah.
So it could incentivize the other neighboring businesses to build.
Yeah.
And I support the commercial landscape like 10%. Seems pretty good.
Yeah. 20 is hard to get to.
Yeah, I think you lose a lot of options that way.
So how many, if we're saying 45 to 50, how many stories does that cap it at?
4.
Okay.
45, yeah, basically, tends to be about
4 stores, right?
Yeah. Yeah, with that commercial first floor is around 14 to 15 feet, and then 10 as well, usually. There are some new codes from maybe 2 years ago now about 18 inches between floors now. It didn't used to be that for HVAC systems and such. So they need a little bit more room to get 4 stories. At least that's my understanding of how the building code works. So I think 55 is the number to get a clean 4 stories with ground floor commercial, I think. So. It's not, you can actually do 45 now. So.
This has never been my vision, having like sort of a tunnel effect.
Except it's just
Well,
those
that's why we're
little
doing
segments.
It's that, yeah.
It's just those little segments, you know, it's,
I
gonna be-
know.
you get past Hidden Springs and then you've got Mary Esther Park.
And that is sort of what part of the reason. Focus areas.
Yeah.
So that we're not- And you, frankly, are not gonna have the market for that.
I'll be dead.
Many of us probably will be.
That's right. The likelihood is high.
Sadly.
And is this something that we also talk about in the subzones that we could maybe
Yes.
allow for a single story in the
Yes.
subzones rather
is,
than
yeah.
requiring 2 stories everywhere?
Yep.
Because I think that might help, that might also encourage smaller businesses to go in.
Yeah.
Yeah, really need to
Yep.
subzoning.
Yeah, that would lean toward those residential properties off back. And yes, that's exactly right.
And again, I think we could also provide some flexibility for smaller sites where it's just can be.
Yeah. Yeah, because we've got some weird lots that are.
Exactly.
Okay, any comments from the chamber?
I just have a quick question. Will the new landscaping standards, do they meet CFAC at this point? Or do you guys have not passed those policies yet in planning?
The new so we haven't actually drafted new landscaping standards yet, but these kind of concepts that we've come up with are loosely inspired by CFAC. So
Generally consistent.
Yeah. And CFAC doesn't require those high thresholds that the city currently has. So to be consistent with CFAC, you would have to lower the landscaping standards.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
It's a good question, Victoria. What shocks me when people know what CPEC is outside of like 5 of us in planning.
So that was actually my question. I was looking it up.
Climate friendly and equitable communities, CPEC stands
What is it for?
for climate friendly and
Yes.
equitable community.
You voted for it.
That doesn't mean that
Yeah.
the anagram is the topmost thing.
I think partly I always forget. Everyone thinks. But there's a whole set of different types of requirements, standard processes that go with that legislation.
And one of them was the tree canopy, right, for parking lots, but we're
Right.
trying to avoid big parking lots like this, so.
Yeah, and they did, yes. So I think again, what we're proposing PA ought to see like that. But those requirements include for certain areas within communities, essentially promote walkability and promote pedestrian access. And so that's where we are looking at those standards for some of what we're proposing.
Any other comments on the slide?
Okay.
Just a couple more to get through. Parking locations is something we've discussed in the past, so our current recommendation is to only allow off-street parking strictly behind the building or underground. So a few things to consider, that sort of requirement. Overall, will just help improve the walkability, storefront character of the street. It's just more, tends to lend itself more to attractive pedestrian-oriented design, similar to how Willamette Drive currently is. However, it can be more restrictive and can be more challenging for smaller, especially lots with less depth to achieve, where they don't have room for parking to locate behind the lot. So some options would be to only apply that in certain areas, such as only along 43 or certain subzones, or to expand where parking would be allowed. So allow it as the ground floor, like a ground floor garage. So at grade, but only limit the percentage of that ground floor. So similar to how we're recommending a limited residential ground floor percentage, apply that same limitation to parking. So you don't get a bunch of ground floor parking garages. And also an option would be to allow parking adjacent to buildings, but apply specific standards to any parking area that is adjacent to the building to ensure you kind of avoid the situation that's shown here in the bottom right, where parking just butts up right against the sidewalk. So require certain setbacks or landscaping buffers, or only require for smaller lots. So those are some of the options that we are considering. So a couple questions would be, should parking be allowed in more areas such as the ground floor or adjacent to buildings beyond what we've recommended? So yeah, I'll just open it up.
And I'll just, as I did on the last one, kind of relay some of what we heard from our technical advisory committees. Again, the folks from Oregon City, I had some very helpful comments on that. And one of the things they said was that they're pretty strict and not allowing parking or kind of drive aisles where you're driving your car between the sidewalk, street, and the building. But beyond that, they do allow it next to buildings, and they are also more flexible when you get kind of off of their kind of main streets, the streets where they're really trying to promote pedestrian access and connectivity. And so, you know, in those places, it's okay to have it next to the building. It's okay, but they did advocate for things like landscape strips, you know, and things. So it's the parking's not right, but it's against the sidewalk. But they basically said they're pretty firm on the don't do parking between the building and the sidewalk, so people don't have to cross the area to get into it. But beyond that, they provide us they're more flexible. So, and then the other thing we heard, one of the other members of that group was that this kind of approach goes kind of hand in hand with how much of the frontage of the property should be devoted to a building versus other things. So, so that you don't have sort of only 25% of the frontage of building and 75% is a parking area. So sort of thinking of those standards as well. So I just kind of know those things.
So what about the access to the parking? How does that get drawn in here? So you have a building and then they're parking behind the driveway, like just put as many driveways as you need to.
So that's a good question. That also came up in our meeting earlier this week. So a couple of things on that. One, there are particularly off of Highway 43, you've got limitations on access that are controlled by ODOT, control the road, and you have access spacing standards along, and they vary by the class of street or category of street. And the goal is not to have a driveway, into every single small property or every 25 or 50 feet. So there is typically a goal to limit the number of those driveways and or to access the site off of the side street instead of on the highway. So that's another thing that kind of goes along with where you have parking is what is the allowed spacing of those access points along Highway 43. So no, you don't end up with sort of unlimited access points. Some of those access points will continue to be up to 43, especially if there's an existing one and some of these, maybe they're redeveloping property, they're not limiting the access, but for new access points, they're often going to be off a side street if that is an option for people. So if somebody's landlocked, they don't have the ability to access, off of a side street, then the access is going to be up Highway 43 because you still got to provide access. So.
But there's a lot of, and this will come into traffic discussion and everything. There's an awful lot of access on the side streets that are really, really close to 43 that can be rather dangerous.
Yeah, and there are typically, even on those, there are some spacing requirements. 43 to the first access for new accesses.
For new access.
But there's existing ones that, maybe going to stay there. Somebody redevelops, they may have their access point. There's a lot, and as long as the highway is managed by, the road is managed by ODOT, then there's going to be, they're going to have a role for access to that.
Thanks. Victoria has a question.
Yeah, really quick. So in regards to the access, so what if someone put an underground parking and their access, they come out like into the, into where, all the shops are? Is that considered highway access? Because they would just be going wherever that commercial traffic would be going. Is that considered having that asset go into the street? Onto the highway? Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense. So I'm thinking of across from the library, underneath, is it 503? Is that the restaurant there? Underneath 503, we have that, not like we have it. There is that small underground parking structure, right? And it leads straight up onto Hood Street. No, Burns. Thank you. That's not considered highway access. It's it's a full block off the highway. So that's kind of, I think, what we're talking, or what we're mentally envisioning. Is that?
Yeah, because I think that would, again, if you could motivate them to do that kind of undergroundish parking, and then you have, again, like when I come out of the library, I go all the way around the back to like to the light. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So that kind of resolves a part of that issue.
So you bring up a good point, like would that thing off of Burns, that little parking garage, would that be considered ground floor because it's at the ground floor of this one street, or is it semi-underground? Like how does that fit into?
You could probably call that underground. Yeah, I think they had to regrade that site to get that there.
Got it.
Yeah, and if you're thinking new sites, if it's property that's just being built, you could actually, I think there could possibly be more incentive to do an underground, a true underground, if they haven't built it yet.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. And underground parking is about the most expensive per parking space that you can build. Surface level is obviously the cheapest because you just pave over the dirt, you call it parking and stripe it and you move on. The one thing that we might be missing on here that we should at least consider putting in space for is a parking above ground parking garage. Like right here, they've done it really well in Lake Oswego, where you don't actually realize there's a parking garage behind all of those buildings, right? There's a couple floors down below and a few floors above, but it's hidden inside. In sort of it's kind of encapsulated by some of the structures in front of it. So that's an
Texas donut.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and that's,
Really?
It works.
that's owned by the city.
Correct.
It was purchased with redevelopment funds.
Correct.
And it was called the donut hole, and that donut hole allowed for or encouraged the development around it.
Yeah. So we should at least consider that as some sort of option. I mean, I think we're decades from that happening, but we may want to leave it open.
And then the other related thing, which is a little bit similar, is tucked under behind the building. Behind the building.
Then we have some of that.
It's, yeah, it's just it's on the ground floor, but there's building above and the parking is just underneath the portion of the building. And that's kind of an in between.
Yeah.
Cost because it's on the surface.
That's right.
And with the topography that we have,
That can
parking
be more
here in the
common.
building is that ground
Yeah.
level up here, so it doesn't look like
Right.
you're on top of.
Yeah, in the back, you don't see it.
Right.
In front, you don't see it at all.
So can you write standards like that don't allow the parking garage frontage to be on 43?
Yeah.
But it can be underground or whatever it's called.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the tuck under is a good example, and Russell's example of Bellagio's, that they have that behind that building is, there's some tuck under parking right there. So, yeah, that's what's that?
Secret parking.
Secret parking, keeps you out of the rain and sun. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good example.
We have Westland Chamber comments?
Hi, I just have a quick, because CFEC will affect the developers because it lowers that minimum of what they have to provide for parking. So I think you're still going to have to consider some street parking is going to have to happen because, yeah, if it's like 0.4 of a parking spot per person, or it's low. It's basically allowing them to build a building without any parking.
Well, so to be clear, in West Lynn, they do not have to provide parking. As of December 16th, 2024, as approved by City Council, parking is not required. Now, what we hear and the developers we've spoken to say, yeah, it may not be required, but this is an auto-centric suburb. We're building parking because we know no one will buy or come to our business or residential units without parking.
Yeah.
So we're pretty confident we'll get it, but it allows them to not have to meet that minimum threshold. But now we have maximums. So you have a maximum number of parking spaces because really don't want the empty sea of parking.
Yeah.
We have a great example right behind us here at Safeway up here on the hill. Most of the time, that's not even close to 50% full. I'm not talking about the day before Thanksgiving. I'm talking the other 360 days of the year. It's very, very empty up there, right? So it's now been adjusted, so no minimums anymore. But I do think developers will look at, they know what we're auto-centric. They know what they're doing. They'll build parking for sure.
So you don't believe that you'll need incentive to get them to do that?
No, I think we'll need some incentives to get them to do some more expensive things. I mean, I say this flippantly, I don't mean it. Developers are, generally speaking, in business to make money. I mean, look, I come to work because they pay me, not because I'm a really nice person. I mean, I am. But no, but they're in it to make money. So they're looking at where's my best return on investments. They're going to be doing that. So we may need incentives to get things like underground parking. We may. Because if they can do, if they can do surface level and it costs about, I mean, the last time I looked, it was $5,000 for a surface level spot and like $40,000 or $50,000 for a buried spot. That's a huge difference in costs, but that was like 12 years ago. So we may need some incentives to get what we want there, right?
I think that Russell, do you want to say something?
I was just thinking, so like I own a building on where A Street meets Highway 43, and there's I don't know what it is. It's like an old duplex that's right next to the parking lot for my building.
Yep.
And the only access to that building is off of Highway 43. Like you're not going to maintain that if you ever tried to buy it. And if you were going because the topography of A Street, you're not going to be able to create that tuck-in parking on the backside and the front road access. Like it's just, I mentioned this last time. I was just reiterating that it would be because of the hill and the way A Street is. Like if we have these blanket requirements, we're going to end up with that rundown duplex continuing to be there.
Yeah.
I think Yeah, we definitely heard some comments kind of last meeting about there needs to be some flexibility for lots that are narrower or smaller lots. Where it's really difficult or challenging or impossible to either put the parking in the back or, build it without. So I think, yes, we are, and we heard that also, I think, at our advisory meeting. So definitely point well taken. I mean, we need to think about that in terms of, especially allowing the sign in those situations.
Not a solved issue, but one on the radar of
Yeah.
the project. We're gonna have to try and puzzle that out, yeah.
So yes, thank you. Good reminder.
Here's a question, maybe, Chris.
Yep.
What are the current parking regulations? And in particular, I'm thinking about the new Manhattan real estate
Uh-huh.
that has moved into, it's on 43.
Yeah.
That was just built within the last year or so.
Yeah,
It's like 80% parking and then
Yeah.
surrounded by, that's all legit. I mean, they can have.
well, because that was previously built, yeah. Yeah.
That's the current.
That space is actually over the maximum number we would allow today. But because that was a remodel of an existing structure and only 50%, because it has two buildings, only one of them was remodeled. They're allowed to keep that parking, but there are like 3 or 4 spaces over their maximum allowed for the use.
It just visually, it looks like a big horseshoe with just
Mhm.
empty stripes
Yeah,
in the center. It's,
That made me sad that happened right before we got all of this.
yeah, they actually came in for a pre-application conference to build another 24-unit parking space in the back, kind of by those woods. We basically said no. There's a water resource area creek, and it would be really difficult to do, if not impossible. But at this point, our code had been approved by council in December. They came in January, and that code has capped their number of parking spaces. So they can't build another one if they're already over the current standard. So, yeah.
And I see that place a lot. One time I saw a parking lot built. once.
Yeah.
yeah, it's never.
No, but to your point, right, that's it's 2 buildings perpendicular to the highway with parking in the middle, and it's not very pedestrian friendly, and B, it's just not a very attractive way to go about doing it. We want to be able to solve these things over the years. We'd actually hoped that site and the Sourdough Willies would sort of combine to be one big site and do something really creative and fun.
Yeah.
But of course, it takes money.
Timing.
I don't have any, so, there you go. But no, we're with you on that, but they're capped. So there are a few over right now. Can't build any.
We need to discuss anything else in the slide, like whether this should apply in certain areas or anything like that.
You all, if you think it should apply in certain areas or should it apply throughout the entire, I think we just have one more slide after this.
I think that's the question would be, should there be some more flexibility on Highway 43 in these focus areas?
Yeah.
And I think you can just sort of say generally, yes, if you think yes, and then we can come up with our approach.
Yeah, that's pretty generic.
Meaning they could put parking in front of a building potentially.
You still might,
To the
Sub-
to the side.
maybe there's more opportunities to do it to the side. You still maybe would not want to have parking right in front of the tent. I mean, that could be it's sort of like, Oregon City is lined in the sand.
Gotcha.
You don't do that, but you've got more flexibility other than that.
But it will get really, really tough on some of those residential Old River, right?
Yeah.
Back on those residential properties that are residential now, some of those are built pretty much side to side on the property. So what options would we allow them if they wanted to come in and, hey, I'm going to open a cool bookstore in this old house?
Yeah.
Where does my parking go?
Yeah,
The parking lot at the church.
Yeah.
You're saying more from a walker. If it's an existing structure, you might just have to have an exception. So
Yep.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, and that's actually a very good point for reuse of an existing structure, but maybe some exemptions in there. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, and there is street parking, but that's not always ideal. Streets, you're still legally allowed to park in the street.
Right, okay.
But yeah, to your point, that makes sense.
Well, it looks like Lynn has advanced us to the next slide, so I think we move on to.
We think it's strategy.
Yeah. Just move the slide and we'll start talking about something else, right?
Yeah, we have 25 minutes, so.
And this is our last major topic, right?
Yes, there's a
Okay.
few slides after this, but it's just kind of wrap up. So this is the last discussion item is whether there should be a minimum housing requirement for development. So we haven't drafted this yet, still kind of conceptual, but a couple examples for how to require minimum housing would be to require minimum density along certain areas, specifically along Highway 43. Example density to start with would be require a minimum of 40 to 50 units per acre, which may sound like a lot, but typically for 3, 4, 5-story mixed use developments, it's pretty easy to achieve. So a couple examples you may be familiar with: the Windward Weiser Blocks development that developed out to about 86 units per acre, and then this mixed use development in Milwaukee developed to about 180 units per acre. So it's pretty easy for multifamily mixed use, like mid-rise mixed use, to meet that threshold. Another option for requiring minimum residential would just be to require a minimum residential floor area rather than units. So requiring 75%, that might be a little bit more flexible, but then you aren't setting that unit threshold.
Yeah.
That might encourage larger units. And some of the things that are driving this, the city's housing production targets. West Lynn is needs to meet a target of about 3,000 units based on state projections from the Housing Accountability and Production Office. And this also kind of dovetails with the recent housing production strategy that was adopted. Few actions from that strategy that really encourage more multifamily and affordable housing. A few of the specific strategies include rezoning land to allow for more multifamily and mixed-use development. There's some strategies for incentivizing multifamily development and production, including the multifamily housing tax exemption tool. And then there's just a few affordable housing strategies. Typically, affordable housing is provided in multifamily and mixed-use developments. And then lastly here, the corridor, I'm sure as you are all mostly aware, most of the multifamily and redevelopment opportunities in West Lynn are along the Highway 43 corridor. So that's where most of the capacity currently is. So basic question here is, should there be a minimum housing requirement? And if there should be, where should it apply? And what tools should the city use? Chris or Matt, I don't know if there's anything.
Just really briefly, again, from the meeting we had a couple days ago, the main comment on this topic was just kind of back to flexibility, and for smaller projects, for smaller lots, provide a certain amount of flexibility that might not for some of those, even though I'm going to call it kind of a mid-sized development. Those are pretty achievable in densities if we're thinking about something like that. For smaller lots or projects, it can be a little tougher to get those and still get what you need to get on the site. And so that was the suggestion there, was just provide a certain amount of flexibility based on the project size or the site size. And we heard that from the some folks at the state land conservation development.
So what I see, going back to the first slide, is, we talked about having auto stuff. Well, you wouldn't have, I don't see having auto stuff on the bottom and housing on top.
Yeah.
So.
Right, you're not gonna build apartments on top of the car wash. So,
Yeah.
so by having a housing requirement, then you kind of backtrack on some of those other concerns that we had.
Yeah.
And Mary, this is something I wanted to go back and just touch on really quick. You brought it up, like this wasn't really your vision, right? And we fully understand that. I think what is nudging this process along a little bit as Brandon has on here, is the capacity of Highway 43 for larger development opposed to other places in the city. We do have what I guess we would call mandated by the state. We need to build 3,000 units in about 20 years. So we typically build 35 to 40 units a year. So we got to pick it up in a big way from a housing production perspective as a city, or there are consequences to not doing so. So the state sort of drives housing, a lot of the housing rules nowadays because of the housing crisis that we're in. And one of them is saying, okay, each city is going to basically have a set number of units you need to produce over a 20-year period. And again, to Brandon's point, we recognize that really the true place right now that we can do larger unit development is on Highway 43. It's not in the random neighborhoods we have throughout, right? I mean,
It has access to. What was the number you said we're cranking out here?
yeah, you know, one year I was here, it was 16 units. Another it was 4, about 35 to 40 units a year. We're seeing more with middle housing, but not a lot.
And I think part of what, for the first step to provide the ability to hit those targets is to update your zoning to allow for it to happen.
Right.
If your zoning does not give you the capacity to do that at all, then it's definitely not going to happen. The city's not going to building to do it. You can provide opportunities for land use.
And that was one of the explicit strategies from the housing production strategy, not only rezoning, but rezoning to allow for density. Right. That, I think that was one of the major deficits for the housing capacity analysis is there's been a deficit of production.
And just a limited amount of land. So for that,
Out of all those permits, almost all of them were for single family homes on 10,000 square foot lots.
Yeah, townhouses and single family homes, mostly single family homes. I think, but to Commissioner Jones's point too, you typically want to be building more dense housing on transit lines and near goods and services that people need, walkability to a grocery store, the library, et cetera. So I fully get what you're saying earlier, and this is just sort of where we're, the kind of the option we have. We didn't start Vision 43 necessarily with that in mind, but as the housing production strategy came through and came about, and also MIG is our consultant on that project, on our housing production strategy, we certainly see the synergy. Thank you. Wow, I was like literally completely blank there. Synergy between the two projects, that if we're even going to come close, these are the spaces. But also to Matt's point earlier, these focus areas do allow us at least to keep it in sort of a contained space and not just create this tunnel of run-on stuff, right?
it's not the entire.
Right.
Questions, and just, it's kind of a callback. When we first started this conversation, Darren had mentioned it a couple times, cottage style housing developments, kind of what we saw in the co-op. It was something that was discussed earlier.
Cottage cluster.
And is that something that's still in conversation, or is that kind of?
Still available to anyone to develop, yeah. I had someone at the counter yesterday asking about it, if he could do it, yeah.
Okay.
So I want to ask Victoria, from a business perspective, what do you think about the housing requirement?
I see that it's very needed. The thing that I always worry about is every time someone talks about affordable housing strategies, I worry about that because a lot of this may not exist, especially if you don't meet your minimum. So I'm always a little bit worried about that, what's considered affordable and how that's truly going to happen. Again, I don't know. It's a little crazy sauce, so.
Yeah.
So you would support requiring housing?
Yes.
Okay. And
Absolutely. Because also think about that when you have housing, especially in that type of a retail environment, that allows those businesses to stay open even longer. Therefore, they're making more revenue. Therefore, you'll have more traffic because, like, if I can't get off of Highway 43 at 6 o'clock, I may be able to go in for a late supper at 7 or 7:30 and get to enjoy that property as well. So housing actually is really beneficial in that type of area. I just don't know how affordable it's going to end up being.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, is that that localized customer, sort of built-in customers, it also helps to create and enhance your community development. You start to know people. And one of the tenets, one of the things we're trying to do with Vision 43 is be more supportive of local businesses having success. Not always large national chains coming through, but the local folks. So again, churning our economic dollar through our own community over and over again has a lot more value to us as a community than shipping it off to McDonald's in Chicago.
Russell, do you have any comments on that? Russell?
No.
You might have dropped it off.
Okay.
I know he's working right now too, so he's.
Bo, do you have any comments?
I always go for more housing.
Okay,
Excellent.
great.
So my question about that is there, when you say requirement, does that mean someone could not build a fully commercial building? Like we're talking about, like, you know, building a building that might have maker spaces on it and such.
Yeah.
They couldn't do that.
Well, so this is, that's, you got there. It is on these lists.
I got there.
That is on a, you did, it's on a list of policy questions that we'll be going through, planning commission and council. Go ahead.
Yeah, but we're talking about here that could he have like retail and then maker spaces?
Right, I understand,
Yeah,
I hear, but it's also a larger question is, will we allow large single-use development? We need a 35,000 store, 35,000 square foot grocery store. Are we going to exempt that from some of these?
And it depends on the size and the configuration of the site. You could potentially have a building on the site, it's just purely commercial or non-residential use, but another building that's residential use, if there's enough room on the site to do that. So, I mean, I think there's different ways we could approach this. If it was there had to be a residential component of the development, then that would mean, yes, some portion of the development would need to include housing, whether it was above or next to, or it could just be, and that could vary again by site size, you know, and also it could vary by whether or not it's got a certain amount of depth on 43. I mean, I think we do need to be thoughtful about how we implement this kind of requirement, because there might be situations where either A, it conflicts with our desire to have storefront kind of commercial development, or B, it's just not feasible given the size of the lot, or C, it kind of makes it really hard to develop a lot. So I think that's why I'd say it sort of depends on how we approach it, and how much flexibility is around it. So I think that's kind of what we would be helpful to hear. Like, A, is it important to require a certain amount of housing in these focus areas? B, should there be some flexibility or variability on how and where we do have the area?
And then if they're gonna do housing, then does that minimum density kick in?
Yes, and then if we were to apply a minimum density, if somebody's going to do housing, the minimum density would kick in. Again, we might want to think about varying that a little bit depending on the size of the site and the configuration of the site, so that it doesn't prohibit the site from doing something that sort of meets the intent of the vision for this area, but, you know, wouldn't be feasible if they had the intent. Now, one of the comments we heard, one of the folks on the advisory committee was like, you know, like, be a little, provide some flexibility so you don't preclude good things from happening just to hit this density requirement, which might not be realistic in every development or site. So,
And we have some really odd parcels.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, it's a good point.
Something that came up, and it was mentioned by more than a couple of planning commissioners in this context, was the need for putting in affordable housing, for putting the residential requirement and making it a percentage. And specifically, the first people were talking about kind of making micro ghettoizations within these developments. The affordable housing section would be here. You know, when we did this in Rogers Park in Chicago, it was saying they would be mixed in with the rest of the developments, so it wouldn't be distinguishable. So when you're putting in your affordable, your Section 8, your HUD, they're mixed in with the rest of the residential, and so you're reducing the stigmatization of the property, and you're doing things that are much more beneficial to the health of the community, the scholastic development of families that live within there, the academic success of children in those households. So this was something that was.
So let's hear from the group here. What do they think about requiring a residential component?
I think it's necessary. I think, I like that last part, but the one part about it's affordability. I mean, you look on Kenthorpe where they threw in 3 houses and each, the new house are about $1 million each. It's like, that's not affordable. And that's, but affordability as far as maybe rental properties goes, that's really, so I think that's, you need to maintain that. And then if you get 3,000 units, that's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult. So.
Yeah, the average American, as a couple of years ago, can no longer afford them.
Yeah.
More than 50, 60, 70% of the average American. In fact, we couldn't figure it out that if you take a look at the average cost of a house in the Willamette Valley and the average income of the average person who works in the Willamette Valley, it doesn't work. And one of the things that came out in reports a year and a half ago was that that it's a generational wealth pass through. That the only way that housing is continuing is the older generation is taking out loans or equity on their own existing property or taking out their savings and applying it towards the down payment to allow these houses to be born or purchased for first-time home buyers or families that are trying to establish, especially where you've got a community like West Lynn, where our schools are one of the major reasons to come here. So we need those first-time families coming in so that our schools can get the funding to make us still the special shining school benefit that everyone likes.
Excellent conversation. We have 5 minutes left.
So I'll take up one. So with that, and so making sure that that is still continuing, you still need those families coming. You need to make it so different. And right now we're stopping, we're in an era where we're stopping the American. And that's not happening.
Lake Oswego's already hit it.
So you're gonna like put together standards that like have some flexibility in there.
That I think is what at least we've heard so far.
Okay, thanks.
Probably wrap it up. Take on the last
Sure.
slides.
Yeah, and I'm gonna go pretty quickly. So this is just sort of letting you know, and I mentioned this at the start of the meeting, that we have started to prepare this document, which is the document that will be adopted along with the new mixed use zone. So this is the kind of how it's organized, and again, it's sort of pulling information in from the stuff we've done up to this point. So it describes the area, the process, the conditions, talks about what we've been hearing from the community throughout the process, vision and goals, which we adopted and not adopted, but prepared and discussed earlier. Some of the graphics or visuals that we looked at earlier in the process kind of go into that code and concepts. The transportation improvements that we talked about last time at our meeting would get woven in here, and then ultimately, how does this get implemented? So we've started working on this. The next slide just kind of shows you some examples of what some of the pages of the document look like. The next. So that's just kind of like gives you a sense of the layout of the document, and we're trying to make it a pretty visual document. Use as many photos, graphics, and icons and things like that as we can. So it's maybe we'll make it up and print out immediately. Maybe read some of the words along with the pictures. So that just kind of gives you a sense of what it looks like. So that's a work in progress. So next steps, continue to work on and revise these zoning recommendations based on the conversations we've had with y'all, technical advisory group, planning commission, and council. It's going to continue to be kind of an iterative process, but we're trying to have as much discussion along the way. So again, we don't get to the adoption phase and it's all kind of new to people. We have also talked about sometime later this summer, having a public open house or workshop to do some of this stuff as well. We don't have a date for that yet, but we're looking at probably August for that. And then continue to work on and revise and draft the remaining sections of that master plan that you just saw in the last couple of slides. And then go through the adoption process in the fall with that goal of being done by the end of the calendar year. And then this was the last sort of scheduled, or I guess planned meeting for this group. But we wanted to see if you'd be open to having one more meeting when we are at the point of having a completed draft of both the plan and the mixed use zone. We thought you might want to take another look at that and just give us any comments before we do go through that adoption process. But you didn't sign on. You want to say, you want to make sure you're.
Well, it seems like we should, because there were things we discussed today that aren't written yet, they're developed.
If
So,
you didn't want to meet, which I prefer in person, but if you didn't want to, we could always send you, and you could do some electronic review. It's just certainly not as robust of a process doing it that way.
Is there anybody here who would object to another?
Are we talking close to the end of this year?
I think we'd be talking about probably early fall for a remaining meeting. Yeah, because we'd want to do it before we got into that process, and that's going to be kind of in the late fall. Almost.
I would not object to a slightly shorter.
Okay, maybe try to at least an hour and a half or something like that.
Keep it tighter.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can do that. Do that. Well, this was this is short.
oh, this is two.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
How long, what did it feel like?
Or we can go to.
Like 3-hour meeting.
Uh,
That's right.
3 hours and something, 2 hours.
Out of government work, we're used to.
Yes. We're just warming up.
Everybody say no.
Okay.
Do you want to do a temperature check on, just because I tossed it out of what other people had mentioned on the. If we do a residential percentage. I just want to remember.
Like just an appropriate way to do it, like we were talking about, some of that stuff.
And I will say, that was something that was identified in the housing production strategy that happen along with this. It could happen separately. It's going to require some, community review, et cetera. I'm not saying it would happen as part of this, but that's the thing that's about.
And affordable housing in Westland is not very affordable.
When we talk about affordable housing, in that context,
It's a standard.
yeah, it's a standard. It's basically affordable to people who make less than a certain percentage of that area.
Yeah, exactly.
And, so that's.
But not of Westlands.
I know, that's what I come. Oh, okay, got it. I do have a question though, with this mixed use code draft. Are we reviewing this next, is that what we're gonna review next time?
An updated draft.
And updated after that, okay.
But if you have comments on this,
So I did have like
email
a
them in.
couple things.
Oh, yeah.
We'll send them to
And I
us.
would say send them to us, as a follow to this.
It's just a couple of small.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the thing, I would also say, we're kind of, that if you have looked at this, you have any specific comments, do send them along. Please, please do. But yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
All right.
Bo or Victoria or Russell, any comments from you guys? Oh. Matt Bell dropped
Matt's
off.
dropping off. Thank you, Matt.
All is good. Nice to meet you, or at least see you all.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bo.
Thank you.
Looks like Russell's dropping off too, so.
Okay.
Okay, well,
All right.
let's call it a day. Yeah,
Thank you all.
Thank you.
yeah. Thank you guys. Appreciate your time.